With the Security Council's Resolution 713 and onward, as the military actions of the Yugoslav People's Army and Serbian paramilitary forces have spread further on into Croatian territory and Bosnia and Herzegovina, it was obvious that the UN Secretary Council has sealed Croatia's and Bosnia and Herzegovina's tragic destiny already in 1991, with its conclusion, and I'm citing, while it was neither possible nor useful to deal with all the causes of the crisis which threatened peace and security on a larger scale, no factor on the Yugoslav scene was completely free from guilt, for none had lived up to its responsibilities. Politically correct, value-neutral, and ambiguous language of the Council's reports, decisions, and resolutions enabled the international community to socially construct reality that was in sharp opposition to the one experienced by people in Croatia and Bosnia-Herzegovina. But nonetheless, it served to offload their responsibility for the effects that political decisions will have on future war developments. The aim of our paper was to deconstruct socially constructed application of transitional justice policies in post-conflict societies of Croatia and Bosnia-Herzegovina, which are imposed by the international community's most prominent human rights institutions and courts of justice. It is argued that their sophisticated, imperialistic neo-colonial approach hinders post-conflict societies in their efforts to cope with the realities of the war effects on their personal and level of community. Paradoxically, this approach dehumanizes people of Croatia and Bosnia and Herzegovina, treating them still as victims and not as survivors who have the right to express their feelings, traumas, and war memories free of internationally assisted, value-neutral truth and justice. Namely, the Anglo-Saxon power politics and expert opinion makers treat war survivors with arrogance, paternalistic care, and patronizing condescendence, assuming that post-communist societies are ill-equipped, unprepared, and unable to deal with the challenges of social transition, democratization, war crimes, human rights, unless they're supervised and led by Western liberators of helpless nations. However, inability of the international community to successfully prevent the violence and recover security, justice, and peace at the beginning of the war conflicts is now equally matched with their failed efforts to restore confidence and trust in rebuilding mechanisms of transitional justice and human rights policies. What has become of the Vukovar and Srebrenica genocide past is now translated into policy interventions that are to patch and mend shattered civic trust in war-torn societies. As lab experiments, Vukovar's and Srebrenica survivors' memories, identities, and histories are mixed and matched by the international law and human rights expert in order to fit the mirror lenses of the transitional justice and then sold as fully fledged product of the Western democracy to the troubled, underdeveloped societies in crisis. Therefore, it is argued that transitional justice policy represents a sophisticated tool which enables international power politics to reconstruct post-conflict collective memory, identity, and history of the people, deeply traumatized by the genocide and atrocities committed in the name of greater Serbian ideology. Its policy mechanisms conceal the true neoliberal agenda of the human rights and transitional justice policies of the Hague Tribunal courts. Based on the prescribed Chicago principles of post-conflict justice application, survey documents in this social inquiry without exceptions confirm the overall assumption stated by the international power politics and expert opinion makers that post-communist, post-war societies of Croatia and Bosnia-Herzegovina must come to terms with their violent pasts if they are to ensure lasting peace and stability of their reconstructed democratic nation-states. Coming to terms with the past as precondition for building peace and future relationships, though, provides a valuable insight into the relevance of conflict transformation and peace building in the aftermath of the bloody war and genocide. namely practical application of the transitional justice and human rights policies in respective post-war society highlights the limits of its implementation on both levels, societal and individual. Therefore, on the onset of the social inquiry, one is confronted with following questions. Why is it peace building at the end of the 20th century and onwards so fundamentally different from the time before the Yugoslav wars? Why is it now prescribed? Who has the right to decide how to rebuild peace, to determine value-neutral truth and justice? Who has the authority to decide when and how an entire nations and peoples are to conform to the rules and regulations of the international supervision and policing? Finally, how civilized and human are internationally assisted reconstructions of the post-war collective memories, identities, and histories? So far, according to the analyzed documents, Western liberators of the guilty Balkan consciousness are incapable to listen to the voices of affected populations of Croatia and Bosnia and Herzegovina. Namely, in their socio-political world, little people must fit into the political settlements reached on their behalf by their respective political elites in order to resolve the issues from the past and prevent a return to violence, which will then ensure stability and security of the international social order and neoliberal cooperative capitalism. That is why the First Council's statement, "No factor on the Yugoslav scene was completely free from guilt, for none has lived up to its responsibilities," marks the starting point of the imperialistic neo-colonial approach to peaceful resolution of the Yugoslav bloody dissolution. With the Yugoslav wars, the modern world is faced with a new line of reasoning, which is in its core ethically and morally wrong. This line of reasoning, established by the UN, is based on the assumption that it is neither possible nor useful to deal with all the causes of the crisis. How does one deal with the crisis if initial causes are not taken into consideration? How is it then possible to choose a proper and efficient way to resolve such a complex issue related to the war conflict if one refuses to deal with initial circumstances, causes of the crisis? It is permissible by the international community not to live up to its responsibility to determine the causes of the crisis and act accordingly, simply because it assumes that this was not possible and not useful. But then when it concerns the parties involved in the war conflict, then being responsible is mandatory. The horror of such political ignorance borderlines with inhumanity if one takes into the consideration that only 2 months later, in November 19, 1991, this line of reasoning has resulted in devastating implications for Croatian people, Vukovar genocide. Political and legal implications of this line of reasoning later on reached its peak with Srebrenica genocide in July 1995. To make matters even more complicated, under the auspice of the UN, the ECTY is set on the path to establish itself as a powerful tool in hands of international power politics, a tool enforced through the international law and legal procedures that was to further civilize international relations of the post-conflict socio-political elites in the countries of former Yugoslavia. The extent to which it was successful in producing this civilized effect is limited with the impact ECTY rulings had on the respective population, since it was evident that major court proceedings related to Ovčara and Srebrenica genocide did not contribute to the restoration of trust and reconciliation in the societies and local communities level, contrary to what was promoted and stated in UN resolutions and by the international high-ranking officials. It is evident that this sophisticated imperialistic neo-colonial approach in tribunals' efforts to civilize the Balkan tribes is further enforced through transitional justice policy interventions of internationally assisted value-neutral truth and justice. The initial line of international socio-political reasoning is in this way incorporated into the transitional justice and human rights policies and implemented in Croatia and Bosnia-Herzegovina, which makes it potentially more savage than the violence people suffered during Serbian aggression. The banality of such evil, dressed up in the modern, sophisticated legality of international law and order, is perceived by Croatians and Bosniaks alike as partial, conditional, and inhuman, since its bureaucratic nature favors legalist approach over human. Thus, when anger, sorrow, disappointment, and anguish with the tribunal's rulings on genocide and war crimes and crimes against humanity is publicly expressed by the local communities in Croatia and Srebrenica, then it is considered nationalistic, primitive, and hostile. This kind of reaction generates even more support from the international community in their efforts to civilize traumatized nations with transitional justice approach, because it neatly offloads their responsibility for the very same situation societies in Croatia and Bosnia-Herzegovina find themselves in. Living up to its responsibility line of reasoning, again, is applicable to the respective society, but not to the proponents of the international community, since they uphold the power to enforce justice and peace based on the superiority of Anglo-Saxon ideas of justice, peace, and rights. While the context and causes of the war were unimportant for the international community to begin with, now in the aftermath of the conflict, when effects have accumulated to the level of such complexity that it's almost impossible to resolve all the inherent issues in a very short period of time, traumatized communities in Croatia and Bosnia-Herzegovina have become again a burden to the international community. The banality of evil hidden behind transitional justice initiatives is therefore stubbornly opposed by the people of Vukovar and Srebrenica, as they refuse to accept legalist approach to truth. They refuse to conform to the plurality of truth, because they do not believe in internationally assisted criminal justice infallibility that failed to deliver what was propagated from the beginning, protection of human rights. The only mechanism that people of Vukovar and Srebrenica have on their disposal is the counteracting culture of denial. Refusal to comply and conform to the sophisticated banality of evil, inherent in the transitional justice initiatives, quite often used and misused by the international and the domestic power politics alike. This counteracting culture of denial presents in Vukovar's and Srebrenica's traumatized communities entails following. They refuse to allow Western liberators of their consciousness to change their memory, identity, history, and socially construct new ones. They refuse to accept postmodernist and neoliberal concept of truth. The truth is not plural, there is only one truth, and contested versions of the truth about the Yugoslav wars, gross human rights violations, and war crimes, about genocide and socially constructed concepts that serve international power politics and government officials to support their own political agendas and offload their responsibility for the crimes committed in former Yugoslavia. For them, Greater Serbia, ideology, Serbian socio-political elite, Yugoslav People's Army, rebel Serbian population, and Serbian and Montenegrin paramilitary forces are the proponents of the Serbian military aggression on Croatia and Bosnia-Herzegovina. This is a primary cause of the war, ignited in two respective republics of former Yugoslavia. They perceive international peacekeeping efforts in Croatia and Bosnia-Herzegovina as futile political solutions to a very complex situation, which, contrary to what was expected, have provided support and maintenance to Serb-occupied territories and authorities during the war. In return, this has enabled systematic forced migrations of non-Serb population, looting and destruction of state and private property, forced imprisonment in concentration camps, and finally genocide. That is why people of Croatia and Bosnia-Herzegovina are reluctant to fully put their trust in the hands of the international community. They demand acknowledgement of their suffering and respect as survivors of the imposed war. They refuse to be sanctioned and shamed for the feelings, thoughts, and beliefs they have about the new homeland, people, religion, army, history, and identity. They refuse to be treated as victims in the society who is submerged into the culture of forgetting. They refuse to be socially labeled as divergent, mentally ill patients detached from the present reality. They refuse to accept imposed reconciliation projects because mutual trust is not restored and it cannot be socially constructed. They believe that trust could only be restored if justice is satisfied, the principal aggressor named and punished for the war and crimes committed in it, and not forced upon them by international peacekeeping efforts. And finally, they refuse to be tolerated and to tolerate others just because this modern concept of civilized behavior is considered as necessary prerequisite for sustainable peace, stability, and functional democracy, without any actual regard to true feelings and understandings of unresolved issues from the past that are in this very deeply repressed way on individual and social level as well. Thank you.